Paul, we'll get started.
Yeah.
All right. So we're happy to have Paul here today talking about import tariffs and global sourcing. We go for an hour. House rules are, if you have a question, just go ahead and unmute yourself and jump in. Augustine is also in the chat room. So if you'd like to leave a note in the chat, he can answer questions there as well. And then we'll stay on after the talk for more discussions and questions. Otherwise, Paul, take it away.
Thanks a lot, Kim. It's great to be here. Appreciate the invitation. So indeed, August is around. I don't think Teresa and Felix are around. You know them very well. Agustin, for those of you who don't know him, as a PhD student at Chicago, who's not on the market this year, but maybe next year, right? And yeah, if you have any questions, you want to raise them in the chat, that's fine. But don't hesitate to interrupt. And I was, if you sense confusion in the chat that I'm actually not on the right track, just raise your voice. Don't hesitate to interrupt me. Okay. All right. Which is the fact that if you look at import tariffs for relatively downstream goods, say final goods, versus relatively upstream goods like inputs, the former tend to be much higher than the latter. So let me illustrate this graphically here. This is bilateral tariffs, average bilateral tariffs. So each dot is a country pair. And you see that just about any country pair you pick, unweighted bilateral tariffs are higher for final goods than for inputs, and the differences are quite stark. Okay, so this is something that Bella Balassa found out, many decades ago, and there's a whole literature on tariff escalation that sort of emerged in parallel to the literature on effective rate of protection, which is sort of centered on this fact. Now that's sort of partly a motivating fact for this paper. More broadly, this is going to be a paper on trying to make sense of trade policy, and hopefully it's a little bit easier to motivate this topic now than a few years ago, where we were in this very tranquil policy period where we had other things to kind of worry about. And the recent U.S.-China trade tensions are a good example of this recent unilateral increases in tariffs. There's one aspect of this recent increase in protection that perhaps has been less emphasized, although it has been emphasized, which is, it overlaps with the concept of tariff escalation, which is many of the recent increases in tariffs had actually fallen on intermediate inputs rather than on final goods. So let me illustrate this graphically for the case of the US. Pre-trade war, we had very low tariffs on imports, less than 1%, not very high, but significantly higher tariffs on final goods, 4.6. If you look after the tariff war, where we are now, it's much higher for inputs. It's more than it's higher by a factor higher than 5, maybe higher than 6. For final goods, it's higher, but it has barely only doubled. Okay, so lots of the recent increases on of tariffs have fallen on inputs like steel and other inputs rather than on final goods. Now, why?
Sorry, Paul,
why? Yes,
I didn't fully follow that. I mean, tariffs went up by the same amount in both sets of goods.
Yes.
Am I not reading this right?
In terms of level of percentages. Okay.
Yeah, the percentage point change was pretty common, it looks like.
The percentage point was common, but if you look at the ratio of tariffs on final goods versus inputs, that ratio is orders of magnitude smaller today than it was pre-tariffs. And I'm gonna come back to this, but this is going to be exactly the ratio. That's what I'm going to call tariff escalation wedge, if you will. That's going to be the relevant thing in the framework that I'm going to talk about. Okay, so it's going to be the ratio of 1 plus this object. Okay.
Okay.
But that's fair enough. I need to tell you why the ratio is what matters, not the absolute difference. So why does this happen? So we all were listening to President Trump, and the stated objective of all this was to bring back manufacturing into the US. Now, the gut reaction a lot of us might have had, perhaps because we didn't like him for other reasons, is this was absolutely crazy. This is not going to work. And I'm not sure what exactly we had in mind, but if I had been on his side and I had been trained as a trade economist, I could have well invoked results in the trade policy literature, thinking about work by Venables or Ralph Ossa, arguing that in some cases, trade protection might actually be a powerful tool to redirect demand and entry towards my market. And that can actually lead to an increase in manufacturing into my market. And in fact, this can actually be welfare enhancing. Okay, so unilaterally, maybe that's not such a bad idea. Now, some folks started saying, yeah, maybe that may be the case, but a lot of these tariffs are falling on inputs and those are increasing input costs. So it's not clear that's going to work. And preliminary empirical work, there's some recent papers by Flan and Pierce, Handley and co-authors, Down and co-authors, that has indeed argued and shown that the initial response of manufacturing, US manufacturing, to this round of tariffs appears to have been negative. Not much of an effect on the sectors that receive protection, and negative impact on downstream sectors that saw their cost of production go up. Now, you might still, if you're a Trump person, or if you sort of, wanted to defend this line of modeling, saying that tariffs might be good, you might say, well, those are long-run models, right? This is about, we're going to move demand towards our market, and that's going to lead to entry, but we don't expect that to happen very, very quickly, less so in the midst of a pandemic. So you might still say, look, maybe in the long run, we're actually going to start erecting statues for Trump because he actually did do something that led to an increase in manufacturing in the US. So in other words, we have evidence on the short run, and we might be interested in understanding more what are the long run implications of increases in tariffs, in particular, increases in tariffs that fall not only on final goods, as in traditional models of production relocation, but also fall on intermediate inputs, okay? Now, there's two ways to do that. There's one way to kind of speak to the long run issues, which is to move back in time. And we can do that for Trump tariffs, but let me take a second to advertise one of my students on the market this year, Lydia Cox, who's actually looking at the long run impacts of, or longer term impacts of the Bush tariffs of the early 2000s. And she's finding that even if you look 15, 20 years down the line, there's still quite sizable negative impacts on downstream sectors. Okay, so that's one way to get at it, and you should all look at her paper. Another way to look at it is to use a model, to actually think theoretically, conceptually, what do we expect the long run impact of these tariffs is going to be in a world in which there might be entry, and there might be some long run effects of these policies.
Paul,
yes.
You didn't talk anything about like terms of trade type effects. I thought like the US dollar appreciated with the Trump tariffs, and that's going to have a positive side. Is that something that shouldn't be part of this discussion, or we don't? Okay.
Absolutely. George, I'm going to
Okay.
come back. So you're anticipating that, I don't know if that's what you have in mind, but the relocation, the trade relocation literature, or the literature on where tariffs relocate production to your market, it's typically cast in partial equilibrium, ignores terms of trade effects. We're actually we have those floating around. So I'm going to come back to this. Okay, so I hope you see, I'm sort of on the one hand talking about tariff wars, on the other hand talking about tariff escalation. I hope you see that there's a connection here, which is basically we're using this sort of pieces to kind of motivate us to think a bit harder about why might you want to set differential tariffs on final goods on inputs. If there's a reason for having higher tariffs on final goods than on inputs, what is that reason? And if that reason exists and you go through an episode in which you don't follow that guideline, how bad can that be? That is, what can happen in a few years following the current trade war. So in this short talks, we typically ignore or sort of jump through the literature review. But I feel like it's important for me to kind of give you a bit of background on how the literature has thought about tariff escalation. And the part of the reason for that is because I think it's interesting, and I didn't know about it, and it might be, you know, even if you don't like my paper, maybe you'll get something out of this whole session. So first thing might be, okay, let's go with George. And, you know, neoclassical theory doesn't have relocation effects, but it certainly has thought a lot about terms of trade effects. So we might say, what does the neoclassical theory have to say about this? Does it provide any rationale for tariff escalation for the fact that you might want to set higher tariffs on final goods than for inputs? Now, my reading of that literature, and I think it's a non-controversial reading of the literature, is that it's very messy. If you work with models with constant returns to scale, homogeneous goods, Ruffin, Casas, Das have papers along these lines, and you end up with optimal tariffs that might be different for final goods than for inputs, and they partly might be shaped by some trade elasticities that are different for inputs or final goods, but they also depend in a very strange way on the net flows, like are you importing or exporting inputs, are you importing or exporting final goods? So there's no sharp insight from that literature in terms of whether it makes sense that just about any country in the world and just about any sector in the world, we tend to see higher tariffs for final goods than for inputs. Then there's a modern revival of trade policy in what one might call neoclassical models. So these are going to be typically Ricardian models with product differentiation, which we know we can microfound like Eaton and Cordham. And, you know, work by Arnaud and co-authors, and more recently Beshkar and Lashkaripur, has shown that this differentiation and the fact that you have gross flows in any sector, and the fact that they're Ricardian models with just one factor of production actually generate very neat implications for optimal trade policy. In particular, in the initial QJE paper of Arnaud and co-authors, which, you know, had related to some previous work that made similar points, you have this result that optimal tariffs should be common across sectors. That is, if you are free to set policy with an unrestricted set of instruments, namely, you can use not only import tariffs, but also export taxes, you're going to want to stay away from taxing imports in different sectors differently, even if, say, differentiation might be different in different sectors. The optimal way to exploit the terms of trade is through export taxes, not via import tariffs. Beshkar and Lashkaripur, they take these models and they turn them into Caliendo parallel type of models in which you not only have differentiation, but you also have input-output links. And they argue and they show that in that setting, you also want to have flat optimal tariffs, regardless of the input-output links. That is, even if some goods, some sectors might be very upstream in the sense that most of their output goes to other sectors rather than final consumers, or a sector is very downstream, most of their output is sold to final consumers and not to other sectors, the optimal tariff, import tariff on those sectors should be the same. In a second best world, like the US world in which we might not have access to export taxes because the US Constitution rules them out, they show that in that case, you want to distort, you want to have different import tariffs, but if anything, they argue that import tariffs should be higher for upstream sectors. And the reason for that is that this is it's a way to mimic the effect of an export tax. By jacking up the price of your inputs, you're going to achieve a higher price of your exports, okay, that are using those inputs, and that's mimicking the optimal way to manipulate the terms of trade. So if anything, this literature tends to generate an optimal tariff de-escalation rather than optimal tariff escalation. Now, you might have a different view, which is, okay, forget about models. I'm just going to estimate inverse export supply elasticities. I learned since I was an undergrad that an optimal tariff, that's what it should be looked like. So maybe we're just sort of talking about this. And at the end of the day, what's happening is that the inverse export supply elasticity is much lower for inputs than for final goods. Now, you know, it's not obvious how to either measure the positioning, you know, how upstream or downstream sectors are, or what those elasticities are. But if you take state-of-the-art measures of these objects, the correlation goes the wrong way. That is, you're not going to get very far explaining tariff escalation through simply by differential elasticities. So with this background in mind, what we're going to do is we're going to try to explore.
I'll one more question. Kind of going back to like this input and final goods. So if we think about capital goods as being input into production tomorrow, we sort of know, like in the macro literature, you really don't want to tax capital inputs at all. Should I have some, does that intuition not work for explaining why like final good taxes should be low? Final good tariffs should be, import tariffs should be relatively lower than intermediates?
That's a very good question. My gut reaction would be, to properly answer that question, I would have to look at optimal tariffs on final goods, capital goods, and inputs. Like separate those. And actually, I know we've looked at this, and I don't know, I don't want to put you on the spot because maybe you don't remember the same way that I don't remember. But let me just answer it this way. I mean, I'm sure that there's lots and lots of stuff we call inputs that you and I would agree they're not really looking like capital because they can be accumulated and things like that. So I'd be surprised if what we're capturing is something with capital. But having said that, we're not going to think about Chambly-Jat type of logic for this.
Okay.
And it might actually matter it might not be orthogonal to what we're doing actually, but honestly, we haven't thought too much about that.
Okay.
Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to go a different way, which is, George has this nice idea. Maybe it's about dynamics or accumulation. Maybe what we're going to have in mind is something different, which is we're going to stick to a, static or like standard timeless trade model. But we're going to think about a world that is outside the neoclassical paradigm. So in particular, we're going to look at a Krugman / Osa world in which final goods and inputs are going to be produced with increasing returns to scale. Both sectors, the upstream and downstream sector, are going to be monopolistically competitive, and we're going to have product differentiation. Okay. Now, when you start thinking about what's going to shape optimal tariffs in this world, it's obviously complicated. You're going to have the relocation effects that Van Ovels and Osa emphasize. We're going to be in a general equilibrium framework, so we're obviously going to have effects on relative wages that are governing terms of trade effects. Also, we're going to have relocation effects of upstream and downstream, and those are not going to be orthogonal to each other, because maybe if you want to redirect activity to your country, you want to think about, do I want to redirect the final good producers? Can I do that without bringing in the suppliers as well? Those things interact. The relocation effects upstream and downstream are going to interact. And yet there's another issue that's going to be in the picture, which may not be obvious, because we often in trade work with models with increasing returns to scale, monopolistic competition, and product differentiation that are efficient. But I'm going to show you that generically, even the closed economy version of our model is going to be inefficient. So we're going to have domestic distortions that in a second best world, trade policy is going to be reactive to, or it's going to try to address. So what we're going to do in the paper is to study second best and first best policies in a world with and without domestic distortions. And the main result I want to have you walk up with is the idea that tariff escalation is actually something that can be explained by our model. And I'm not going to say that's the story, but I'm going to tell you it is in line with what the model is telling us. And if you want to think about one reason why tariffs on inputs might be worse than tariffs on final goods, a one-line summary, although it's much richer than that, is the fact that tariffs on inputs increase the cost faced by downstream producers. And if you're in a world of trying to redirect entry of final good producers towards your market so that when you consume those goods, you pay lower trade costs, which is what's behind this Osa Van Ovels business, well, you're kind of making that harder with input tariffs. Okay, input tariffs are going to work against traditional welfare enhancing relocation effects. Okay, so we'll see it's going to be a bit more rich than this, but that's one way to think about that. And importantly, this is all taking into account entry. Okay, so this is, if you will, a long run negative impact of upstream tariffs, not just the short run one that people are unveiling these days. Okay, so I want to tell you about the model. I need to be mindful of time, so there's obviously more literature we build on, and let me just skip it in the interest of time. That some of the papers I might come back to, and if there's specific questions, feel free to raise them. So let me tell you what I'm going to do next. I'm going to describe the model. And the model is very simple, completely straightforward extension of the Krugman model. It's not one that I've seen applied in the trade policy literature, but it's going to be very easy to describe because you've seen it. You've seen all the elements. Then I'm going to open the economy to trade and look at trade policy. And then we're going to conclude by showing you some numbers, some quantification of the model. What do optimal tariffs look like? And doing counterfactuals related to the recent tariff war.
Paul,
Yes.
when you, so your paper is going to be about theoretical justification for the escalation. But then I kind of missed how the Trump thing was the opposite, but so it would not be consistent with that. But I guess, wouldn't that have a simple explanation of just kind of trying to not get the consumers riled up against it? I mean, I just didn't figure, where does the Trump fact fit into your story?
Okay. So my politically motivated self is inclined to answer that I'm going to show you what optimal policy looks like from the point of view of a benevolent social planner. And I don't necessarily think about him as falling in that category.
Okay.
So that's point out. But then you might say, but yeah, but there's lots of those guys, right? So why does then, on average, you still see the fact in the data, and he went against that rule? So I don't know, maybe we can certainly envision political economy reasons why he might have done that. If anything, the political economy literature, what it provides is an alternative explanation for tariff escalation. And that's the one paper I had in bold here that I skipped, the papers by Cadeau and Govandi and co-authors, which basically their view is the reason why tariffs are higher downstream than upstream is because when setting tariffs upstream, the downstream producers are lobbying against those tariffs. They don't want their input providers to have tariffs because that jacks up their cost of production. Whereas when it comes to setting tariffs downstream, the consumers could say, no, we don't want those tariffs, but you have this issue that as consumers, we're terrible at lobbying. We cannot solve the collective action problem. So that's natural. I mean, I do think there's, again, this is a phenomenon that's so widespread that it's hard to believe that one explanation is going to explain it everywhere. I think the explanation we're going to give is reasonable. Why Trump didn't follow this and went his way? Yeah, I don't know. I mean, there might have been other stories there, but it's fair. It's a fair question.
Just one, I guess, question is this related to, I think in sort of standard public finance, Diamond Merle's production efficiency, you don't want to tax the intermediate stuff, you want to tax the final stuff. This seems kind of just very, I mean, obviously your setup here is not their standard setup, but this is just very similar, and kind of the standard motivation for doing value-added taxes is exactly that, no?
Yeah, I that's something that I've it's crossed my mind. I think at the end of the day, the explanation we're going to give is quite different, and it's not associated with that. I need to have a better answer than the one I'm giving you, but I don't think that's necessarily going to be the right way to think about what we're going to say. But let me get back to you at some point on this. It's a good question. Okay, so what's the model? The model is, you all remember Krugman 80, hopefully. You still teach it. So once you teach it, you know it. So it's going to be a two-sector version of that model, but instead of having two final good sectors, we're going to have one sector is going to be the final good sector. The other one is going to be an intermediate input sector. The final good sector is going to produce differentiated varieties. There's going to be an endogenous measure MD of producers, and we're going to have a constant elasticity of substitution sigma. If these goods were produced with labor, with an overhead cost and a constant marginal cost, you're back to Krugman 80. Instead, we're going to have final goods produced with an overhead and a constant marginal cost, but not in terms of labor, but in terms of labor and a bundle of intermediate inputs that are going to be coming from the upstream sector. Okay, so you combine labor downstream with this bundle of intermediate inputs with a value-added intensity of alpha, and then that is used to cover both the fixed cost of production and the number of units XD that you want to produce. Okay, we could have had the fixed cost in terms of labor rather than output. We have it in terms of output. Nothing that I'm going to say is actually dependent on that. Okay, so if you're put off by that, it doesn't matter. Now the upstream sector is producing input varieties, which as you see are used by final good producers. And that upstream sector is using only labor. This is more of a standard Krugman sector in which labor is used to produce output, to expand output, and also to cover the fixed costs. Okay, so notation wise, I've got sigma up here, final good elasticity, alpha, labor intensity of downstream production, and theta, I haven't put the equation, but think about this, QU being a CS aggregator of this omega bars, okay, XU omega bars with an elasticity of substitution theta, okay? MD and MU, which is the measures of upstream and downstream suppliers, are obviously going to be determined in equilibrium, imposing free entry. And there's going to be monopolistic competition in the sector. Okay, so it's Krugman, but instead of just using labor, we use a bundle of inputs in production. Okay, so it's not a roundabout model or anything like that. It's two distinct sectors, one on top of the other. Now, I want to get into the meat of the thing, so I'm going to jump quickly over the closed economy equilibrium, but I do want to tell you, flag a couple of things that are going to come later. So first, solving for the equilibrium of the model is relatively simple. And you can show that the aggregate allocation of labor to the upstream sector, which is the firm level usage of labor times the number of upstream suppliers, this is going to be 1 minus alpha of the labor force. Okay, remember 1 minus alpha is the output elasticity of the bundle of inputs. That's the share of labor that goes to that sector. And alpha obviously goes to the downstream sector. Makes sense? If you actually look at the social planner and how the social planner would allocate labor across sectors, that is actually not 1 minus alpha. The social planner for a value of alpha that is between 0 and 1 would want to place more workers in the upstream sector than the market does. So the market allocation features too little labor to the upstream sector. Because there's too little labor in the upstream sector, this bundle of inputs is not going to be as powerful or as large. This QU is not going to be as large. That's going to affect the productivity of downstream production. And in fact, you can show that the measure of downstream producers is also going to be lower in the market equilibrium than in the first best. Okay. And it's all working through the mass of firms in the sense that if you compute firm level output, it's the same in the market equilibrium as in the social planner problem. So the whole inefficiency is on the extensive margin, just how many people you have entering upstream or downstream. There's too little entry upstream and there is too little entry downstream. So let me summarize this and I'll give you the intuition, obviously. But what we have here is that in a decentralized equilibrium, firm level output is at its socially optimal level, but the market equilibrium features too little entry in both upstream and downstream sectors. There's only two exceptions to that, which is when either alpha is equal to 1, alpha equal to 1, basically you go back to Krugman. I'm shutting down the upstream sector. And we know that the one sector Krugman model is efficient. Another case, which is going to be more interesting for us, is alpha 0. When the downstream sector only uses inputs, there is no misallocation of labor. So the equilibrium is going to be efficient in that case, actually. Okay.
Sorry, maybe I'm missing something very basic here, but each firm is producing the socially optimal amount.
Yes.
Okay, but there aren't enough of firms in either sector. You know, where's the labor going to come from? This is an inelastically supplied labor, right? This is not about the fact that these guys are working too much the people are working too little in this economy.
Yes, but the efficiency of the downstream sector is lower when you have less entry upstream. So you're going to have to hire more workers to produce this downstream level of output, both the fixed cost and the XD. Okay, so you're basically increasing the cost of those workers are going to be going to cover this cost. Okay.
So,
Right.
The labor market is clearing, but rest assured.
But what would the planner do? The planner would want to take labor away from somewhere and put it somewhere else. Where does it want to take the labor away from?
it's going to take the labor away from the downstream sector. Okay, it's going to put it in the upstream sector, and that's endogenously going to reduce the cost of entry downstream and the marginal cost downstream. And so he's going to be able to use to expand output actually in both sectors. If you had two horizontal sectors, you absolutely have the right intuition. I mean, I can't do that, but in this case, you can do that.
I was thinking this is some, go ahead.
Sorry, a more basic point is that if alpha is equal to 0, then you can't reallocate, right? Because labor is only upstream.
That's right. That's why this is the exception. And when alpha is 0, you have efficiency. So I totally agree, and I'll come back to that. I'll actually spend quite a bit of time on that because that's useful to kind of kill the domestic distortion.
Paul, I was just trying to figure out if this was some sort of Romer externality where people aren't internalizing how like their decisions are affecting the cost of entry for other people. Is that exactly what's kind of going on here?
This is one way to interpret that. I'm getting to this in a second.
Okay.
That's,
Thanks.
you're onto something. So let me just state this other proposition, which is trivial, which is, well, what's the problem? We're not getting enough workers in the upstream sector. A domestic subsidy upstream is going to be sufficient to restore efficiency. Okay, so whenever we have a domestic distortion lurking around, let's have a subsidy to address it. What's the intuition behind this result? So let me be contrarian, George, and first tell you how some other people might have interpreted this finding, which is, oh, I understand what's happening here. The upstream sector is monopolistically competitive. So these upstream producers are slapping a markup over their marginal cost. So that's distorting the choice of downstream producers between labor and inputs. They're not doing what's socially right. And that's the distortion that's affecting productivity downstream, and that's what you're finding. And that's a plausible interpretation of this. But that, it gave us a little bit of pause, the fact that, the distortion, the social planner wants to put more output in a way that is sort of, it gives us pause that the market allocation was independent of the parameter that governs the markup, right? You would have thought, okay, the market allocation is distorted downwards because there's theta floating around. No, theta is not affecting the market allocation. So an alternative one is what you have in mind. And, a way to see that is you can basically take our model of internal economies of scale and working with the equilibrium, since we have symmetric firms here, you can turn it into a model, isomorphic model, in which what you have is our external economies of scale. And this is, we borrow tricks from work by Kucheravi, Lin, and Rodriguez Clare. And then you can, in this isomorphic economy, where there's perfect competition and external effects, you see that basically a way to interpret the external, what's happening in the market equilibrium is exactly what you said, George, which is the upstream producers, when they're entering, they're not internalizing that their entry decision is endogenously increasing the productivity of the downstream sector. And because they don't internalize it, there's too little entry, and you want to subsidize that entry. So it's a bit more of a Romer type externality. Okay. So anyway, I spent probably too much time on this, but it's kind of cool. It's a very simple model, and you see that some of the results are actually not entirely trivial. But let's move on to the meat of the paper, which is the the open economy version of the model. And what we do here is simply two countries for now. We're going to have trade in final goods and inputs, and there's going to be two types of trade barriers. On the one hand, we're going to have natural trade barriers, trade costs, downstream and upstream. They're potentially different, but we're going to assume they're symmetric. And then there's man-made trade barriers, tariffs for now on final goods on the downstream sector, and tariffs on the upstream sector that are set by each country vis-a-vis the other country. So they could potentially be asymmetric. But for the most part, we're going to focus on the tariffs set by one country, let's call it home, both on downstream goods and upstream goods. And then later, I'm going to introduce other instruments. We might envision country I using export taxes or subsidies, upstream and downstream. And we might also envision the government using subsidies. Okay, and why? Well, I've just told you that in the closed economy, when alpha is not 0 or 1, the planner actually wants to use a subsidy. You can write down the equations of that equilibrium. We do that in the paper. It's not hard, but it's really hard to work with that. I mean, if you thought about, I'm going to write down the equilibrium as a function of the tariffs, and then I'm going to write down social welfare and maximize, choose the tariffs that maximize welfare and have a beautiful expression coming out of that, it's just not going to work out. I mean, we've tried and it gets really hard. So what I'm going to try to give you, down the line, I'm going to give you some quantitative results, but I'm going to try to give you some intuition, build intuition through a variety of particular cases of the model. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time on the alpha equal to 0 case. We're still using inputs in production downstream, but the downstream sector is not using labor. And as Cecilia mentioned, there's no misallocation of labor in that case. So that's going to be a useful thing to start with. And to derive neat formulas, we're actually going to work with a small open economy case. And that's something that we owe a lot to Ivan Werning, who discussed the paper in the summer and showed us that that was actually much more feasible than we thought at first. Then I'm going to stick with the small open economy and analyze a more general case with alpha positive, and you have domestic distortions floating around. And then for the general case, not small open economy, I'm not sure how much time I'll have, but we can look at a first order approach, looking at the effects of tariffs around a 0 tariff equilibrium and figure out exactly what those look like for inputs and final goods. And here we built a bit on work by Baki and Fari. And then I'm going to wrap up with the quantitative evaluation. So we're still missing a key theorem or proposition, and I'll be very honest about that. But I'm going to show you, I'm going to try to convince you why, when we do look at the quantitative model, we always have found tariff escalation through a variety of examples that might illustrate why that's the case. Okay, so so what am I going to do? I'm going to begin with a small open economy case. Okay, and here, following Ivan's recommendation, we're going to look at this through the primal approach to trade policy that was developed by Arnaud, Ivan, Vogel, and Donaldson, and then there's a more recent paper by Arnaud with Ivan and Andres Rodriguez Clara. What is this primal approach? Which I recommend, if you haven't looked at that, take a look at it. It's actually pretty cool. I didn't fully appreciate it until we put it to use ourselves. So the way you're going to do that is you're not going to do this Ramsey business of I'm going to write down social welfare as a function of the tariffs, and then I'm going to start taking first order condition and hope that I have a good day and manipulate them in a way that is insightful. So instead, we're going to first solve the planar problem of the allocation of, given this economy, given these resources, where do I want to put labor? How much I want to consume of domestic goods, how much I want to export, how much I want to import, so on and so forth. So we're going to look at the optimal allocations. Then we're going to look at the market equilibrium where you have the taxes. You might have import tariffs, export taxes, subsidies, whatever you might have. And you try to see, can I implement the first best? Okay. Now, if you had a unique way to implement the first best, then that's the optimal policy. Typically in these problems, if you have enough instruments, there's going to be several ways to implement the first best. And then you can say, this can happen, this cannot happen. In some cases, like in a second best world, you might not be able to implement the first best with the policies you have. In fact, I'm going to show you that that's the case in our very simple model. If I just have import tariffs at hand, I'm not going to be able to achieve the first best. So what do you do with that? Well, you can still use the same primal approach, but then think about a planar problem that faces a constraint problem. There's going to be some optimality conditions that I can't quite hit because I don't have the instruments to hit. But I know exactly how I'm constrained. Okay. So that's basically what we're going to do, and we do it rather than doing it with a whole model with entry and so on and so forth. We just work with the isomorphic economy with that looks like a model with external economies of scale. So basically, you have some aggregates. You have consumption of domestic consumption, consumption of foreign goods, final goods that I export are all functions of firm level output times some function of the measure of firms. You have it for final goods. You have it for inputs. You have labor upstream, labor downstream. That's the product of firm level labor and the measures. And then to kind of have the isomorphism, you have a level of productivity of the upstream and downstream sector that is a function of the amount of labor you put in the upstream sectors, that's the external economies of scale. The more labor you have upstream, the higher productivity upstream. Downstream, productivity is endogenous to the allocation of labor downstream, and how much inputs you use downstream, because that also expands output and increases productivity. When we work with the alpha zero case, this disappears, okay? So, and this becomes the total labor force, okay? So that's gonna be a bit simpler in that this productivity terms are only gonna be affected by input choices, okay? So let's work through one case. I know I'm mindful of time, but I think it's cool to kind of work through one. Before I just start stating results, let me show you how exactly we do this, okay? So what I told you is in the alpha zero case, the first thing you do is you set up the planner problem. So the planner is maximizing utility, which is basically domestic consumption plus imports, okay? And again, you might say, well, where are the integrals? That's all in the CHH. That's basically aggregate consumption of domestic varieties and of imports, CS aggregator. Then we're gonna put labor in the upstream sector. So that's why we have LH, all labor force at home is going there, achieving productivity AUH. And that output is either gonna be, this output of the upstream sector is either consumed domestically as an input in the production of final goods at home, or it's exported and is used by foreign final good producers in producing their final goods. The downstream output is given by this FD, that's basically this function here, times the productivity of the downstream sector, which is endogenous to the level of output downstream, and it's used for either domestic consumption of or exports of final goods. Okay, so these are resource constraints. And then we have trade balance. Trade balance tells us that whatever we import, right, these are imports of final goods and our imports of inputs that the domestic final good producers use to produce output, these imports need to be equal to exports. And we export final goods and we export inputs. And notice what we have here is basically, we are taking into account that our export price is not fixed. Even though we're a small open economy, our export price is not fixed because our good is differentiated, so we are moving up and down the foreign demand for our good. And that's captured by this term here. We don't, this would be CHF times a price, but the price is going to be negatively impacted by our exports. We're gonna want to constrain our exports to improve our terms of trade by increasing the price at which we sell those exports. And that's mediated by sigma, and for inputs is mediated by theta, okay? Now this bars, this is the foreign ideal price index for their domestic varieties. This is their consumption of own varieties. All this is, I put bars on it because this is a small open economy, so I can't affect those things. The planner is going to take those as constant. Okay, so it's going to simplify the problem quite a lot because I don't need to worry about world market clearing. Okay. So that's basically the problem we're solving, just choosing six objects to maximize this. If you work through the first order conditions of this problem, you can simplify them to three conditions. The first one is marginal rate of substitution equal to marginal to relative prices for final goods. Marginal rate of transformation in production of final goods, usage of domestic and foreign inputs is equal to the relative social cost of those things. And then there's a last condition that basically is an arbitrage condition relating to what you do with domestic inputs. Okay, so let me go one by one in a little bit more detail and tell you where this is coming from. So as you can see, this is a term that is less than 1. Okay, so basically what this is telling you is that the social relative cost of domestic consumption and imports, okay, or the relative cost of domestic consumption is lower than you would infer from relative prices. So this is actually goes back to Gross. This is something that Gross in his 84 paper stresses, which is that that's a reason to have import tariffs in monopolistically competitive models. And the reason he said is basically when we import goods, we pay a markup over those goods, and that markup stays in the foreign country. It is either cashed by the exporters or it's used to hire labor in the foreign country. For the domestic guys, we pay a markup for the domestic varieties, but the markup stays at home. It's either profits for domestic firms or it goes to higher labor in the entry margin. So the social cost of imports is higher than you would infer from relative prices. That's why you either want to have an export tax, increase this, or you want to have an import tariff. Okay. For inputs, we have a similar thing here, which is the marginal cost, the social cost of foreign inputs is higher because we're paying a markup over marginal cost. That's one way to think about it. Okay, again, you can think about external effects, but this is why theta is mediating this. And again, if that's the only optimality condition we had to fight, you'd say, well, I want to have an import tariff or an export tax in the upstream sector. Okay. But that's not it. I mean, there's the first condition, and then there's this third one. And the third one basically says, you know, suppose you have produced some domestic inputs, okay, and you're trying to generate some export revenue. One way is I can sell the input in foreign markets and generate some revenue, but then I'm going to be worrying about theta because I want to, restrict exports to increase the terms of trade. But I can do something else, which is I can use that input and actually use it in domestic production of final goods and then export the final good. Think about moving this term to the right. Okay, so I produce final output with that domestic input rather than export the input, and then I export the final good. And this optimality condition tells you this, I should be indifferent between one or the other. Okay, and that's where this comes out. And here you have terms related to the optimal manipulation of the terms of trade. What's going to be key is this term here, the sigma over sigma minus 1, which is that relative to exporting the intermediate input, not exporting it and using it to produce domestically final goods is actually going to endogenously increase the productivity of the downstream sector. Okay, so you on the margin, the planner is going to want the downstream firms to use more domestic inputs that they would in the market equilibrium. And you can see that that's basically going to make an import tariff on inputs costly because it's going to work against that. You're going to want to manipulate the terms of trade in input markets because you're facing an inelastic, partly elastic demand for your inputs from the rest of the world. But the optimal way to manipulate the terms of trade is certainly going to be an export tax, not an import tariff on inputs. And that's not the case for final goods. So that leads us to this proposition, which is in this case with alpha 0. The first best allocation, you can achieve it with just trade taxes. I don't need subsidies or anything like that. There's no domestic distortion. And although the levels of trade taxes are not uniquely pinned down, we have here in the background, there's we've got learner symmetry, so you can always move all trade instruments up and down in a certain way. But if you look at achieving the first best with a minimal set of instruments, you can do so with an import tariff for final goods and an export tax for inputs. And even if the level of tariffs is indeterminate in the sense that you can move them up and down arbitrarily, the ratio of downstream tariffs, or 1 plus the downstream tariffs, divided by 1 plus the upstream tariff, that is pinned down by the model and is exactly equal to sigma over sigma minus 1. Okay, so there's optimal tariff escalation in an amount given by sigma over sigma minus 1. And again, why is that? Well, you want to manipulate the terms of trade, like George was asking me. Yes, you want to do that. And that sort of would call in this line of models to have export taxes. That's sort of, if you want to have differential terms of trade manipulation because sigma and theta are different, you want to do that through export taxes. But you also want to have, you're mindful of the effect of this instruments on the domestic usage of intermediate inputs. Now, let me move quickly to the, so that's basically restating in words what I said, that basically one way to think about that is that you want to redirect activity, but for inputs, the way to do it is through export taxes, not inputs. Now let's move to the more interesting case, perhaps, in which you don't have access to this export tax for the final good. Suppose you need to use import tariffs, okay, because the US Constitution doesn't allow you to use export taxes. What are you going to do? Well, in that case, you might be forced to use an import tariff because you still want to redirect activity to your market and constrain exports. And an import tariff can partly deal with that. You see it here in this optimality condition. So you're going to want to do that, but you're still going to have this problem here. So relative to final good tariffs, you're going to want to have an optimal tariff upstream, but it's still going to be lower than the downstream one. And in fact, you can show that in the second best, tariff escalation is actually higher than in the first best. Okay, so in a second best world in which you can only use 2 tariffs, you don't achieve the first best, but the best you can do involves using tariff escalation. And again, because although you're going to want to use an upstream tariff, you're going to want to limit its level because of the negative impact it has on downstream productivity. Okay, so that's basically this. So that's, again, it's very special. It's a small open economy case, and it's alpha 0. Okay, so let's move to let's make it a bit less special by looking at the alpha positive case. Now, in that case, we know from the closed economy that we're going to have labor misallocation. Okay, so that basically suggests that we're not going to be able to implement the first best just with trade taxes. We're going to have some domestic instruments. How does the problem look like? I'm not going to go through the details, but it's basically the same as before, except now we need to worry about this allocation of labor, which one by default, everything was going to the downstream sector before. So now we're going to have productivity being endogenous in the downstream sector, not just because of how much inputs we use, but also because of how much labor we might allocate to that sector. And upstream productivity is also endogenous and shaped by how much labor goes upstream. Okay, but you can still solve for, you know, the first order conditions associated with this problem, and you're going to end up with this, you know, variance of these 3 conditions. They might have L's floating around here, okay, and here, but it's these 3 optimality conditions are still going to hold. You're still going to want to equate marginal rates of substitution and of transformation with relative social costs. You still want to have that indifference as to how to generate revenue exporting final goods or inputs. We're going to have an additional, that's going to be the new thing, we're going to have an additional optimality condition, which basically is going to equate the social value of allocating labor to the downstream sector, that's the marginal product of labor downstream, and the marginal value of allocating labor upstream, okay? And again, here is when you put labor upstream, that generates this externality downstream, which in the closed economy was generating an incentive to subsidize upstream production. So we're going to still have that here. That we are going to, a domestic subsidy to the upstream sector is going to be beneficial, okay? So, and this internal optimality condition, you cannot fix it with tariffs or export taxes. So that's why trade taxes are not sufficient. However, if you introduce an upstream subsidy to the to the set of instruments you have, that's all you're going to need. Let's fix this condition, a targeting principle, if you will. I'm going to target that friction by having a domestic subsidy upstream. And in that case, that's all we need to do. You subsidize an input upstream. If that subsidy is a discriminatory subsidy that only applies to domestic purchases of inputs, I don't even need to change the level of optimal tariffs. I can still have, as before, an export tax downstream, sorry, an export tax upstream, an import tariff downstream, and tariff escalation sigma over sigma minus 1. That still would work as long as I add the domestic subsidy upstream. If I don't have the subsidy, okay, that's the nightmare we're fighting now, which is when we've looked at various cases with various alpha, looking at can we solve analytically for this and show that you always have tariff escalation, that's proved to be a bit, much harder. So we're still fighting this animal, but intuitively, we know that the forces that, we had in the prior version of the model with alpha 0 are still going to be operating. There's going to be incentives to attenuate upstream tariffs. Okay, so the force that goes against it is that once we don't have an upstream subsidy, remember, we're trying to move labor to the upstream sector. So here, an import tariff upstream might actually be a bit useful because it's moving, it's basically moving input usage towards the domestic market. And if you don't have an export tax to achieve that, that might be the thing that you want to do. So that's working against it, but numerically, where it doesn't seem to be powerful enough to overturn the intuition that we were getting before. Let me say one last thing about this. I'm not doing great on time, but I need to say this for those of you that might have seen the presentation this summer and an events discussion, which is this implementation of the first pass is one of many implementations. Okay, and in particular, if you have access to discriminatory subsidies that apply only to domestic purchases of final goods and inputs, you can implement the first best with those instruments and tariffs that will not feature tariff escalation. So you can definitely, we cannot say that for sure, no matter what instruments the planner has at hand, we're going to have tariff escalation. Okay, and then it's a matter of debate. He thought there's some implementations that don't feature tariff escalation. He said that to me are more natural than tariff escalation. I don't know if I want to engage in that, in the sense that, sure, maybe it's a matter of taste, but I'm trying to tell you there may be reasons why in a second best world, do you see tariff escalation? In a first best world, they may or may not be, but the second best policies are going to try to mimic what first best policies are doing. Okay, I'm not sure how clear that was, but this is where we stand. Okay, I'm really not doing great on time. I'm going to skip this decomposition. First order effect of tariffs around 0, where you can compare. Basically, it's useful to see if you're interested in breaking up relocation effects in terms of trade effects, which we've sort of collapsed into this external economies of scale model. We have a way to kind of illustrate those differential effects and why they might be more powerful downstream than upstream. In terms of the empirical exercise, let me just tell you what we do. And if you're curious, you can go and sort of read through the details. But essentially what we try to do is calibrate this very simple, simplistic, arguably, economy to the world economy of the US and the rest of the world. We need to pick parameters. So for theta and sigma, we start with a baseline in which they're equal, largely because we didn't want to build in any asymmetries in trade elasticities that might feed back into tariff escalation. But then we have various parameter values, some that we estimate based on exercises analogous to the Amity Redding-Weinstein effect of Trump tariffs on pass-through. We can actually look at inputs versus final goods and estimate theta and sigma separately, and usually I'm not very far from this. We can back them out from markups, and the model tells us that should be connected, so somewhat different. We also sort of rely on the isomorphism and work by Bartleman co-authors and have alternative estimates. Maybe Sam, you're pleased to see that sigma equal 8 is not totally crazy. So that's there's that. Alpha we can calibrate from the WIOT, and then there's some other parameters that are largely irrelevant, and then that basically leaves us 4 parameters to estimate, which you can't really, it's not easy to calibrate. Productivity, the A's in the final goods sector and the input sector, and iceberg trade costs. So we basically estimate the model to match a bunch of moments, and we match well most of them. There's some that we don't match well, a couple we don't match well, and productivity is higher in the US and than in the rest of the world, and especially upstream relative to downstream. And trade costs are about 2.53. That's not crazy high. We know that those tend to be very high. What are we doing badly? That's always good to pause and see where we're doing badly. We're doing badly in moments, and that has to do with the fact that value-added intensity in our upstream sector is 1. I'm pretty sure we have the intuition that if we added input usage in the upstream sector, sort of roundabout upstream, these are moments we could actually hit. So we're aware of it, and we'll see what we can do about that. Okay. Let me just show you one table with results, and then I'll stop. If that's okay, just take a minute.
Paul, you can take a couple minutes. It's okay. Go ahead.
So I think just to tell you what comes out of this. So first, I'm going to show you two things. I'm going to show you a thing and describe the other one, which is, if you look at what optimal tariffs look in this calibrated version of the model, you see that optimal tariffs upstream are higher than downstream. This is the second best. That's what I've told you that we would find. They're significantly higher, or close to twice as large. They're very large. Okay, the first thing you see is, whoa, this is large. And this is large, but theta, sigma are low. This is not our problem. This is true of any model with a low trade elasticity. You're gonna find a very large optimal tariff. You can reduce, can increase the trade elasticity. You go to Ethan and Quorum value of 8. You're gonna get a more plausible, tariff. But of course, the effects of the tariffs are gonna be much more attenuated in that case, because we know that everything has a lower impact in that case. But that's, large levels, but just bear that in mind. When you include subsidies, tariff escalation gets even higher. And then when you have a full set of instruments, here you're basically using a downstream tariff. You see the upstream tariff is basically 0, and the tariff escalation wedge is 1.3322. Why is that? Well, sigma over sigma minus 1 is 4/3. We're extremely close to the optimal first best tariff escalation dictated by the small open economy case. Why? Because relative to the rest of the world, the US is very close to a small open economy. The own trade share of the rest of the world is basically 1. So that's not surprising that we're so close to that. We play with different parameter values. Tariff escalation is always higher than 1. That's my numerical claim, that we have not been able to find an example with less than 1. And then when we look at trapped tariffs, our results here are a little bit maybe disappointing, but if your unilateral optimal tariffs are very high, even if you jack up tariffs and you do so more upstream than downstream, which our model says is a bad idea, all of this is going to be swamped by the fact that you're actually moving optimal tariffs closer to their optimal ones. If you move downstream tariffs from, 5% to 10%, you're still much closer to 40% than you were before. So that's actually going to look pretty good. If you add retaliation, then you start getting losses. And of course, there was retaliation, and retaliation is going to be particularly costly if we have tariffs on inputs. But the effects here are, I could go more on that, but I don't know how, plausible they are, given that our optimal tariffs in the model are so high, and that's sort of first order and sort of explaining these numbers. Happy to kind of continue chatting about that if you're curious, but I should let people leave if they want to. The paper attempts to provide a rationale for tariff escalation. And basically, you can think about low input tariffs, this feature of the data, as being explained by a second best correction for a domestic distortion, if you will, this sort of productivity effect of upstream entry downstream. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Paul. So we'll just open up now. Go ahead and just unmute yourself and jump in if you have a question or comment you'd like to make.
I have one question relative to the size of the optimal tariff.
Yeah.
I'm trying to remember, say, the Broda, Limau, Weinstein type thing. Yeah. Why are these optimal tariffs so big here? Is it something about the structure of the model and the profit shifting, or is it just about this elasticity?
It's the elasticities. I mean, at some point I did this exercise. It is a puzzle in the literature. If you kind of look at the inverse export supply elasticities, these folks estimated, unilateral tariffs should be orders of magnitude larger than you observe in the data, but by a factor of 20. I remember looking at this graph and it was like a factor of 20, if not 20, 10. It was like super high. You need very high elasticities to get inverse export supply elasticities that are small enough to make sense of what we see in the data. So
I mean, is this sort of like similar to the fact that, your trade cost wedge in there is kind of, as in all of these models, are kind of nuts. I mean, we got to have that I put 3 units on the ship in order for one to arrive. And in a similar sense, whatever tariff, kind of the relationship between trade flows and icebergs, and the relationship between trade flows and tariffs in these models just requires kind of, this relationship doesn't bear, it's not.
Yeah, I that's a good way to think about it. I mean, I think what you're saying is if a trade cost of 300% is not killing trade, why would you expect a 40% tariff to do anything, right? So so that's, I hadn't thought about it this way. I would say, however, I mean, the very large trade costs, this is something that, as far as I understand it, how Anderson and Van Winkop came to it, I mean, it's not just purely calibration. I mean, you can actually start computing things and it sort of, these things pile up quickly, but maybe it was model-based, I actually forget.
I mean, if you think about measuring the difference between the price of, I put Kerrygold butter on that ship in Ireland and I buy the Kerrygold butter in the US, that price differential does not look like that factor that these models spit out. So clearly there's something about the models that mapping sort of value flows into trade cost wedges doesn't line up.
That's very interesting. Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. And you know, if you had higher elasticities, then obviously these things would start becoming smaller, right? Because you know, if you had this high trade costs or high tariffs, you know, all hell would break loose very quickly. But we don't seem to believe those elasticities are so high. I don't know. What do you think, Sam? Do you still believe it's 828 or? Oops, you're muted.
Can't hear you, Sam.
Yeah, you're muted, Sam. You're muted.
Oh, there. Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, I guess I agree with Durian about the implausibility of the high iceberg costs. So I guess we were trying to, one way around that is to think of them as more informational costs or something like that, where they wouldn't have these price effects, but they would have the quantity effects. But I do think that's a very, I think she's right to raise that. I definitely agree with that critique of the models we use typically.
But that's the iceberg cost in a model where every firm exports. When you split it up into only some guys export, I mean, the relative price, what's the other kind of butter you like from Ireland, Dorian? There's some other kind of butter that you like and you can't get here, right? That's an infinite iceberg cost. So this is kind of like some average that kind of proxies for all the other costs. I mean,
Sure, but you know, if you're going to write your model down that way, then that should be the model Paul is writing down to think about his thing. So, you know, and then the tariffs, yeah.
No, absolutely. If you wrote like a model that had exporting in it, and then the iceberg cost would be much smaller.
I mean, the other thing, icebergs, trade costs are not icebergs, you know, it's like there's a cost to ship a container. It doesn't matter what's in the container. That can be diamonds or that can be cement, and it's going to be the same cost to ship the container. There's a whole bunch of different things that the model doesn't get.
There I would push back a little bit because, you know, when I put diamonds in a container, insurance gonna be much higher, the cost. No?
But that much higher?
I always buy insurance when I ship diamonds. I don't know what you do. Point taken. It's yeah, I don't know. I mean, I take the point. I don't know how to fix it.
I mean, if you do things in differences, then you kind of hide the problem. So, but I don't know whether in your setup you can do things in differences.
This comes back to just asking, like we said, like Paul's getting like really high optimal tariffs, and they're much higher. Or sorry, he's getting these optimal tariffs that are higher than what we observed. But we don't think that the tariffs in 2018 were the result of like unilateral tariff decisions. They were the result of 60 years of negotiated tariff reductions. So I don't know why we would compare, the current tariffs to those tariffs. You know what I mean?
No, I'm not saying that. Yeah, I'm not saying.
I mean, those were the tariff levels in the 60s. Certainly, those aren't out of line in the 60s, right?
That's fair, and I'm not saying that those were unilaterally optimal, but the point is that because if you interpret what we're doing now as sort of moving closer to the optimal ones, even if they were jacked up a lot, you know, you can do it in a terrible manner, but you're still moving closer to where you want to be if you believe those optimal tariffs. Now, I could think about a model where I know that optimal tariff setting begets retaliation.
Yeah, exactly.
That matters, right? Because then I'm going to be more mindful. And that's why we had this sort of other side of it, which is what if, look at the realized retaliation. And that might be a more meaningful way to do, which is, maybe the optimal tariff is 40%, but we know that if we do that, then they do 40%, and that's terrible. Okay. But I don't know. Maybe that's someone would say, look, optimal tariffs are, if we lived in a world in which nobody saw our tariff choices, nobody would punish us. Maybe that's what we want to be doing. I don't know. I don't know if we have historical examples of, we know tariffs at points in time were much, much higher, right? So, I don't know. I mean, I'm not gonna, I'm not gonna say these are optimal tariffs and I'm gonna swear by them. But I'm not sure exactly how to think about it.
Can I ask you a little bit about how you're thinking about the quantification in terms of the elasticities that you're choosing? So, you had like a list of 4 different elasticities that you chose. I didn't know which one you ended up settling on for your experiments, or were they?
So we did, I think the most tables, correct me, Agustin, most tables are just done with setting them at 4 and at same level, just because they seem reasonable levels and we didn't want to obtain different values for the instruments that had to do with assuming differences in that parameter. Then what we did is estimate response of trade flows to changes in tariffs using the recent tariff war along the lines of what Amy Redding and Weinstein did, and separating it for categories of goods that are final goods or inputs. And that sort of seems sensible. It's similar to what Feigelbaum and others did in the other paper. And that generated values that were actually quite similar.
I guess my question is, I think you're thinking about this as like a permanent change in policy. And so I'm not sure which elasticities you want to kind of be using in a model. Like, if we're using short run elasticities, I don't think this is the right number. If we're really thinking this is a permanent change, these are the long run changes, then I would go to like a different literature to try to estimate those elasticities. I would come with like much higher numbers. But I don't know like how you're thinking about it, because there's no notion of time here.
That's a good point. I have to think about this, but I'll have to think about that. Do we do this with an equation that sort of falls off firm level optimization, or does it sort of incorporate the entry margin, right? Where you're saying that then the right elasticity might actually be higher in the long run. I'll have to think about that. We've backed out similar ones from markups, but then you're really relying on the CES big time, right? That there's a connection between those things.
Yeah, and some models there aren't, right? So
yeah. No, let me think about this actually. I don't remember, and I don't want to put Agustin on the spot, but I think what we did is not, well, I do know for a fact it's not industry, it's not firm level stuff, right? So so you might have a point there. And we can, obviously we've also looked at a wide range of values, mostly when making sure that there is, that we should continue burning hours trying to prove the result, which we still are. All we need is one counter example, and then we can give up. And in doing that, we've obviously gone through larger values of elasticities, and it seems to be there. But quite clearly, when it comes to the counterfactual, the effects of the tariff, the Trump stuff, those values there are going to matter big time. And those were done for sigma and theta out of 4, I'm pretty sure. Right, Agus?
Everything but the counterfactors with sigma equals theta equals 4.
Thanks, Paul.
Thanks. Thank you all for the comments. Really, really helpful.
Yeah, good. So George, maybe you want to turn off the recording at this point?